The morning Clara turned 11, nobody remembered. Not the woman who ran Hargrove House, Mrs. Dillard, who kept a laminated calendar on the kitchen wall with every child's birthday circled in red marker, but somehow always found something more pressing to attend to when Clara's circle came around. Not the older girls on the second floor who whispered and laughed in the hallway at night, and occasionally let Clara sit near them at supper, close enough to feel less alone, but never close enough to matter. Not the volunteer who came on Thursdays to teach reading, a kind man named Mr. Foss who smelled of cedar and brought hard candies in his coat pocket. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Not even the three boys who slept in the room beside hers, who knew her name and her face and her habit of waking before anyone else, but who had their own hardships to carry and could spare nothing for someone else's. Clara ate her breakfast that morning the same as any other. Thin oatmeal, a glass of water, a heel of bread left from the night before. She washed her bowl without being asked, which was the kind of thing she did without thinking, the habit of a child who had learned early that the best way to stay invisible was to leave no evidence of herself behind. Then she pulled on her coat, the one with the missing button on the third hole, and went outside. Hargrove House sat at the edge of a small town called Millhaven, a place that was never quite prosperous enough to feel proud of itself and never quite broken enough to admit it needed help. The town had one main street with a hardware store, a diner, a post office, and a church whose congregation had been slowly shrinking since the mill closed 15 years back. Beyond the main street, Millhaven spread into residential blocks that grew progressively quieter and more worn the further you went from the center, until at the very edge of everything, past the last row of houses and the overgrown lot where the old cannery used to stand, you reached Hargrove House. The house itself was a tall, narrow building of gray clapboard with a porch that sagged on one end and windows that let in drafts even when they were shut tight. It had 8 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a kitchen large enough to feed 12 children at once, and a common room with secondhand furniture and a television that only received 3 clear channels. At any given time it held between 8 and 14 children, depending on the season and the state of the county's placement decisions. Clara had been there 4 years, which made her neither the newest nor the longest staying. She occupied a middle ground in the house's hierarchy that was, in its own way, its own kind of invisibility. New children got attention, good and bad. The ones who had been there longest had carved out their own territories and routines. Clara existed in the space between, noticed just enough not to be forgotten, but not enough to matter. Behind the house, past a strip of weedy lawn and a rusted swing set with 1 seat missing, the land dropped away into a stretch of forest that ran for miles before it hit the river. Nobody went into that forest. That was the rule, not a posted rule, not something written anywhere, but the kind of rule that settles into a place through years of murmured warnings and dark looks. Mrs. Dillard had told each new child the same thing on arrival. The woods behind the house were no place for children. There were sinkholes. There were animals. There was no path and no way back if you got turned around. Clara had heard this speech 4 years ago when she arrived at Hargrove House at 7 years old, 2 days after her grandmother's funeral, carrying a paper grocery bag with everything she owned inside. She had listened and nodded and believed it for about 6 months. Then she had started going to the edge of the trees anyway. Not far, only to where the lawn ended and the roots began, where the light changed from open sky to the filtered green-gray of branches overhead. She never went past the first line of trees, at least not at first, because the forest beyond did look dark and deep and serious, the kind of dark that doesn't invite company. But the edge of it had become hers in a quiet, unspoken way. She went there when the noise inside the house grew too heavy, when the older girls were cruel, when Mrs. Dillard had one of her long bad days, and the whole building filled with a tension that made Clara's chest ache. She went there and sat on a root that had pushed up through the grass like a fist through a floor, and she listened to the trees and felt, for just a little while, that the world was large enough to hold her without noticing she was small. She had found the first coin 3 weeks before her birthday. It was a Thursday, late afternoon, the light already thinning toward evening. She had been sitting on her usual root with her knees drawn up, picking at a loose thread on her coat sleeve and thinking about nothing in particular, when something caught her eye. A glint, small and brief, like a fish turning in shallow water. It came from the ground about 4 feet inside the tree line, half buried in the mat of leaves and dirt that covered the forest floor. Clara sat still for a moment, looking at it. Then she stood and walked to it. It was a coin. Old, clearly old. Not a dull copper penny or a gray nickel from someone's lost pocket change. This coin was larger, the size of a $50 but thicker, heavier looking even before she picked it up. Its surface was dark with age and grime, but along the edges where something had scraped against it, maybe a root growing, maybe an animal digging, there was a faint gleam of gold beneath the patina. On one face, she could make out the impression of a bird in flight, its wings spread wide, and below it a string of numbers she couldn't read in the fading light. On the other face, a pattern of leaves or vines, worn almost smooth, and at the center a single letter that might have been a C, or perhaps a G, the detail too far gone to be certain. Clara turned it in her fingers for a long time. It was heavier than it looked, solid in a way that felt different from anything she had held before. Not the cheap hollow weight of modern coins, but something denser, something that had been made to last. She closed her fingers around it and looked into the forest. The trees stood in their usual silence, the light still filtering through in long dusty columns, and nothing moved except a breath of wind through the high branches. She put the coin in her coat pocket and went inside before the supper bell rang. She did not tell anyone. This was less a decision than a reflex. Clara had learned, in 4 years at Hargrove House and 7 years before that in a life that had given her very little to hold on to, that the things worth keeping were best kept to yourself. The small joys, the small wonders. Once named aloud, they had a way of being dismissed or taken or made smaller by the indifference of others. So the coin stayed in her pocket, and she took it out at night in her bunk after the others were sleeping and turned it in the dark by feel, tracing the outline of the bird with her thumb. The second coin appeared 4 days later. She found it in the same general area, but a few feet deeper into the tree line. This one was partially buried, its edge just visible above the soil. She had to dig a little to free it, getting her fingernails dark with earth. It was the same type as the first, same size and weight, the same gold gleam at its scraped edge, but the design on this one was different. Where the first had a bird, this one showed what looked like a house, tall and narrow with a pointed roof, surrounded by trees, or perhaps mountains. The same string of numbers along the edge, worn but present. The same aged darkness of a thing that had been underground for a very long time. Clara stood holding both coins side by side, comparing them. Her breath was white in the cold air. Behind her, through the trees, she could hear the distant sound of Mrs. Dillard calling in the younger children for their afternoon lessons. She stayed where she was. 2 coins of the same type, separated by a few feet, both half buried as if they had been placed rather than dropped. Not scattered the way a pocket might empty itself if a person stumbled. Placed. That thought sat in Clara's mind quietly and took root. She went back to the forest every day after that. She was careful about it, leaving the house when Mrs. Dillard was occupied with her paperwork and the older girls were upstairs. She moved along the tree line, then carefully inside it, searching the ground with the methodical patience of someone who had never been given much but had learned to pay close attention to what was there. And she found them. Another coin on the 5th day, 2 more on the 6th. Then a gap of 3 days when she found nothing, followed by a single coin caught in the roots of an enormous oak, as if it had been pressed there deliberately, held in place by bark that had grown slowly around its edge over what must have been years. Each coin she added to the collection she kept in a knotted handkerchief she'd found in the lost and found box. She kept the handkerchief under the loose board beneath her bunk, along with her grandmother's photograph and a letter she had received once, 2 years ago, from a social worker who had since been reassigned and never written again. The coins accumulated. 6, then 9, then 12. Each one the same unusual size and weight. Each one bearing a different image on one face, but the same worn string of numbers on its edge. She noticed something else, too. The coins were not scattered randomly. They formed a line. Irregular, with gaps between them that varied from a few feet to 20 or 30 feet, but a line nonetheless. It ran from the edge of Hargrove House's property deeper into the forest, always moving in the same direction, always angling slightly to the north and east. She could not see far enough through the trees to know where the line was going. The forest swallowed the path after a certain point, and whatever lay beyond that was hidden from her. It was Mrs. Calloway who noticed. Mrs. Calloway was the house's part-time cook, a stout woman in her 50s with quick eyes and a habit of saying out loud whatever crossed her mind without pausing to consider whether it would be kind. She was not a cruel person, exactly, but she was careless with words the way some people are careless with lit matches, dropping them without thinking about what they might catch. She came upon Clara one evening as Clara was crouched near the tree line, squinting at the ground, and her voice came out loud and sharp. "What on earth are you doing out here in the dark? Crawling around in the dirt like an animal." She laughed as she said it. Not a mean laugh, but the reflexive laugh of someone who finds strangeness funny. "Get inside. Mrs. Dillard's been asking where you are." Clara stood up and brushed the soil from her knees. She didn't answer. She find something? One of the older girls, Renata, had appeared on the back porch with her arms crossed, watching. Renata was 14 and had been at Hargrove House long enough to build a small empire of social authority among the younger children. She looked at Clara with the particular combination of boredom and mild contempt that was her usual expression. "Looking for treasure?" Renata called out. Did the orphan find herself some treasure in the dirt? The two other girls with her on the porch laughed. Not cruelly, or not entirely so, but with the ease of people laughing at something that cost them nothing. Clara walked past them into the house without speaking. Behind her, she heard Renata say something about children who lived in fantasies because they had nothing real to hold on to, and the laughter that followed was quieter but no less sharp. That night Clara took out the handkerchief and counted the coins again. 14. She aligned them on her blanket in the order she had found them, tracing the line they had come from, the direction they pointed. She thought about the gaps between them, the irregular spacing that had begun to seem less like chance and more like intention, as if whatever had placed them there had done so knowing that some would be found and some would be missed, knowing that a person following the trail would have to work for it, pay attention, earn it. She thought about where the line was going and what, if anything, waited at the end of it. There had been one afternoon, the week after she found the first coins, when she had looked them up in the library book. The Millhaven town library was small, its reference section a single shelf of aging volumes. But there was a book on numismatics that Clara had found by pulling out everything on the shelf until something looked useful. The librarian, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Haas who wore half-moon glasses and kept hard candies on her desk, had watched her carry the book to a table without comment. Clara had paged through it slowly, comparing the images in the book to the coin she had slipped into her coat pocket. The book did not have an exact match, but in a chapter on private mint coinage and estate currency, things she had not known existed before that afternoon, she found images of coins that shared the same general character as hers. Thick, heavy, produced in small numbers for private use in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Some families of significant wealth had commissioned their own coins for internal use. The book explained, as tokens, as currency for workers paid on estate grounds, or simply as expressions of status. They were rarely common enough to appear in general circulation, and their value to collectors, the book noted carefully, could be considerable, particularly if they were part of a complete set. Clara had read that sentence twice. A complete set. She counted the coins she had found so far. 8 at the time. She thought about the images on each one. The bird, the house, the oak tree, the gate, the woman's profile, the river, the hand holding what might be a key, the number, always the same number along the edge, connecting them. A set. She had been finding pieces of a set without knowing it, and the trail was leading her to the rest of them. She had returned the book to the shelf without checking it out, which meant no record of her interest in it, and she had gone back to Hargrove House and eaten supper in her usual silence while the other children argued about the television schedule. In the weeks that followed, the teasing became a fixed feature of Clara's daily life. She was already the quietest child in Hargrove House, the one who read books from the shelf in the hallway long after everyone had stopped wanting them, the one who helped with the dishes without being asked, and sat close to the radiator in winter with her knees tucked under her chin and her eyes fixed on some middle distance. She had never been much of a target because there wasn't much for a target to catch on, but the coin hunting gave Renata and her circle something to work with. They called her the treasure hunter. They made exaggerated searching gestures when she walked through a room, dropping to their knees and pretending to dig at the floor. One of the boys, a 10-year-old named Gordy who copied everything the older girls did in hopes of being found funny, started making pirate sounds whenever Clara came near, and such, until Mrs. Dillard told him to stop without particularly meaning it. Mrs. Calloway mentioned the incident at the tree line to Mrs. Dillard in what she thought was a lowered voice. Clara was not meant to overhear it, but the kitchen had thin walls. She was out there on her hands and knees, in the cold, digging around in the dirt like she's lost her mind. Poor little thing. I almost feel sorry for her. She hasn't got anything to occupy herself with. That's the problem with the quiet ones. They go inward. Mrs. Dillard made a sound that was both sympathetic and final. I'll have a word with her. She did have a word with Clara, a short one, standing in the hallway with her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and a stack of folders in her arm. She said that the forest behind the house was not a safe place and that she expected Clara to stay out of it. She said it not unkindly, but not warmly either, in the tone of someone checking an item off a list. Clara said yes, Mrs. Dillard, and Mrs. Dillard moved on. What Clara did not say was that she had already pushed past the first curtain of trees and followed the coin trail further than she had told anyone, further than the edge, further than the second or third line of oaks, further into the forest than she had ever gone. And what she had found there had changed something in her that she could not yet put into words. Let her tell it from the beginning. The morning after her birthday, with no cake and no mention and breakfast eaten alone because she had come downstairs before anyone else, Clara made a decision. She had 14 coins and a trail pointing northeast and a forest that everyone had told her to stay out of. She had an entire day ahead of her with nothing to fill it except the usual noise and the usual invisibility. And she had, in the pocket of her coat, a piece of paper she had been carrying for 2 weeks, on which she had drawn a rough map of every coin location she could remember, the distance between them, the direction of the line. She packed a bag. Not a real bag, but the canvas tote from the shelf near the back door where the gardening gloves were kept, the kind of thing nobody would miss. She put in her map, a small flashlight, a cheese sandwich she had made while the kitchen was empty, a nearly full bottle of water she had taken from the supply cabinet in the hallway, and the handkerchief with the coins. She put on her coat and her boots, and she went out the back door at 7 in the morning while the house was still half asleep. The forest received her without ceremony. That was what she had come to love about it, that indifference, the way it neither welcomed nor rejected, but simply continued being what it was. The light was pale and cold, the air smelling of wet bark and last night's frost, and the ground beneath her boots was soft and layered, decades of leaves packed into a mat that gave slightly with each step. She moved carefully but not slowly, her eyes on the ground, following the line she had memorized. She found the 15th coin 20 minutes in. She found the 16th and 17th within the hour. Beyond the point where she had stopped on her previous trips, the forest changed. The trees grew older and more widely spaced. The undergrowth thinned, replaced by a carpet of moss that held the cold and muffled sound in a way that made the forest feel suddenly private, as if it had closed a door behind her. The light shifted, too. Less green, more silver. The sun was higher now, and the canopy here was sparser, and the light came down in broader columns that made the air shimmer faintly. She found the 18th coin at the base of a stone. Not a boulder, not a natural formation, but a stone that had been cut and shaped, a rectangular block of pale gray granite about the height of her knee, half buried in the moss with years of growth covering its sides. She crouched down and brushed the moss away with her fingers and found that the stone was not alone. There was another behind it, then another. Markers, she thought. The word came to her before she understood why. The stones were placed in a line, running parallel to the coin trail, 3 or 4 feet apart, each one roughly the same size and shape as the others. She followed them with her eyes as far as she could see before the trees blocked the view. Someone had placed these stones here. Not randomly, not as a wall or a fence, but as markers, deliberate and spaced. And beside the first one, pressed into the crack between stone and earth, the 18th coin. Clara sat back on her heels and looked at the stones for a long time. She had known, in some part of her that operated on instinct rather than reason, that the trail was leading somewhere. She had felt it in the way the coins were placed, in their consistency of size and weight and type, in the patience implied by their spacing. Someone had done this. Someone had walked this line through the forest at some point in the past, and left behind a trail of coins as if they expected someone to follow it. The stones made the intention clearer. This was not scattered chance. This was a map. Clara ate half her sandwich sitting beside the first stone marker. The forest was quiet in the way deep places are quiet, full of small sounds that only become audible once the louder world drops away. A branch settling. A bird she couldn't see calling from somewhere high up. The faint drip of moisture from leaves. She listened and felt no fear, only the particular kind of alertness that comes with knowing you are close to something important without yet being able to see it. She followed the stones. They led her for another mile through the forest, maybe more. Time moved differently in here, unattached to bells or schedules, measured only by the slow change of light through the canopy above. She found coins at intervals along the way, not beside every stone, but scattered in the leaves nearby, some of them so deep in the soil that she had to dig carefully to free them. Each one the same weight, the same unusual thickness, the same suggestion of gold at the scraped edges. She was up to 26 coins by the time she reached the place where the stones stopped. They ended at the edge of a clearing. Clara stood at the tree line and looked out. The clearing was roughly circular, maybe 60 feet across, and at its center stood the remains of a building. Not a ruin exactly. It was too structured for that word. More like something that had simply been allowed to wait. A stone foundation, solid and intact, rose about 3 feet from the ground on all sides. Within it, the structure that had once stood there was gone, collapsed inward at some point, its timber walls and roof reduced to a low tangle of rotted wood and creeping growth. But the foundation held. The stones it was made of were massive, cut and fitted with a precision that age had not undone. Thick-trunked vines had climbed the outer walls and wild grass had taken the floor inside, but the bones of the structure were absolutely, unmistakably deliberate. Someone had built something here, something meant to last. Clara walked slowly into the clearing. The ground was different here, firmer, as though the earth had been packed and leveled at some point. The grass that grew across it was shorter and finer than the undergrowth outside the tree line, the kind of fine turf that grows where soil has been disturbed and compacted and then left alone for a very long time. She could see, in the way the grass grew, a faint suggestion of paths, lines in the overgrowth that might once have been walkways leading to and from the foundation. One ran from the tree line where she was standing directly to the nearest wall of the foundation. Another crossed it at a right angle, running parallel to the longer side of the structure. They were almost invisible now, the grass having smoothed over them, but in the low winter light at the right angle they were unmistakable. Someone had walked these paths enough that the earth still remembered them, still held the shape of them under decades of regrowth. Near the far edge of the clearing, half swallowed by the roots of an oak whose trunk was wider than Clara's arm span, stood a stone post. She went to it and pulled away the growth that covered its face and found, carved deeply enough to survive decades of weather, a name. Or what she thought was a name. 2 words in a formal, angular script, Calder Hall. She said it aloud, quietly, to no one. The forest didn't respond. She stood there for a moment with her hand on the carved letters, feeling the depth of the cuts in the stone, the precision of them. Someone had done this work carefully. This was not a name scratched hastily with a nail. This was the work of a craftsman, each letter cut with measured strokes, meant to be read for as long as stone could hold a shape. She traced the letters with one finger. CLDR-HELL. She wondered how old it was. The stone itself showed no crumbling, only the dark staining of lichen along the top edge and the softening of corners that centuries of frost and thaw produce. She thought it was very old. She thought it was meant to be found. She moved back to the foundation and walked its perimeter carefully. The stones were gray and green with lichen, cold under her hands, solid as the ground itself. At the far end, set into the foundation wall, she found a door, or rather, the frame of one. The door itself was long gone, but the frame of cut stone remained, and below the threshold, stone steps leading down. Down into what? She could not see. The flashlight in her tote bag had not left her mind since she had packed it. She pulled it out now and clicked it on and pointed the beam into the opening. The steps were stone, steep, maybe 8 of them, ending in a space below ground level where the ceiling was low and the walls were close. A root cellar, she thought, or a storage room. The kind of thing old houses were built with. She stood at the top of the steps for a long moment. Then she went down. The room at the bottom was roughly 10 feet by 10 feet. Its walls were fitted stone, dry, remarkably dry given how many winters had passed over them. She had expected damp, the way cellars were always damp, the way anything underground in this climate was damp. But the air was cool and still and carried only the faint mineral smell of old stone. No mildew, no rot, no trace of water damage on the walls or floor. Someone had built this room with serious forethought, had thought about drainage and airflow and the slow, patient work of decades. She pressed one hand flat against the nearest wall and felt the stone solid and unmoved, not a single shifted course in the fitted blocks, not a crack where weather had found purchase. The ceiling was low enough that Clara had to duck slightly, though for her height, it was not uncomfortable. The floor was packed earth, cold and firm beneath her boots. On 3 walls there was nothing except stone and the occasional thin root pressing through the mortar, pale and searching, finding only darkness and dry air. But on the 4th wall, directly opposite the stairs, there was a shelf. It was built into the wall, also stone, 3 tiers of it. And on the shelf sat objects. Clara moved the flashlight beam slowly across them, her heart doing something loud in her chest. There were boxes, small wooden boxes, perhaps a dozen of them, dark with age, their lids fitted tightly. Some had rusted clasps. Others had hinged lids sealed with what looked like wax gone dry and cracked. Beside the boxes stood 3 glass jars, large ones with metal lids, their contents obscured by the dark glass and years of dusty air. And on the lowest shelf, sitting alone and unmistakable in the flashlight beam, a leather case, the kind that might once have held documents or drawings, its stitching still mostly intact though the leather itself had gone dark and stiff with age. Clara stood very still for a long moment. She was 11 years old, and she was alone in a room that had been sealed from the world for longer than she had been alive. The forest was silent above her. Hargrove House was miles away. Nobody knew where she was. She reached out and touched the nearest wooden box. It was solid under her fingers, the wood dense and heavy. She tried the clasp. It was rusted shut and did not give. She tried the next box. Same. The 3rd one had a clasp that moved with pressure, slow and stiff, the rust grinding audibly as she worked it. She got it open on the 4th try and lifted the lid. Inside, on a lining of cloth gone brown with age, lay coins. The same coins she had been following through the forest. Dozens of them, packed in neat rows, their surfaces dark but the gold gleam visible even in the flashlight's beam. She picked one up, heavier than the ones she had found in the leaves. Less worn. The bird on one face was sharper here, more detailed, its feathers picked out in fine lines that the forest coins had lost to time. She turned it over. The other face showed the same narrow house with the pointed roof but clearer now, and below the house, in text so small she had to bring it close to the light, 2 words, Calder Estate. She set the coin down carefully and closed the box. Her hands were shaking, just slightly. She was not sure she could have said why, whether it was cold or excitement or the particular feeling of standing at the edge of something large enough to change what you thought you knew. She opened the leather case. Inside were documents. Old paper, stiff at the edges, covered in handwriting that was dense and formal and in places faded to the color of weak tea. She lifted the top sheet carefully. The paper crackled under her touch, protesting the movement after years of stillness. The header read, in ink that had kept its darkness better than the body of the text, Last Will and Testament. And below that, a name, Edwardine Josephine Calder. Clara read slowly, the flashlight held in one hand and the paper in the other, her lips moving slightly the way they did when she was concentrating hard. The language was old, the kind of language that filled in its own gaps with formality and did not explain itself simply. But the meaning was not impossible to follow. Edwardine Josephine Calder, the document said, of sound mind and deliberate intention, established at the time of this writing a testamentary disposition of all lands, properties, and holdings pertaining to the Calder estate and its associated accounts, in favor of no specific person or persons, but to be held in perpetuity for the individual who shall demonstrate discovery of the estate's source through the following of the appointed trail. The trail, as established by the undersigned, begins at the boundary of the Millhaven municipal lands and proceeds northeast through the Calder forest holdings along a line of markers placed for this purpose. The finder who reaches the estate's source, who enters the repository, and who presents the coins retrieved along the appointed trail as proof of their passage shall be recognized as the lawful inheritor of all that is contained herein and all that is secured in the name of the Calder estate. Clara sat back on her heels with the paper in her hands and thought about what she had just read. Not a person named, not a family member, not a lawyer's client, not a name on a list of potential heirs. A finder. Whoever followed the trail. Whoever was stubborn and patient enough to walk through the forest in the cold and pay attention to what the ground was telling them. She was 11 years old. She lived at Hargrove House on a state stipend of $42 a month. She owned a coat with a missing button and a grandmother's photograph and a letter from a social worker who had since been reassigned. She had been mocked for digging in the dirt. She had been told the forest was no place for children. And she had followed the trail. And she had the coins. 27 of them, proof of passage, sitting in a handkerchief in her bag. Edwardine Josephine Calder had been certain. That much came through the old ink without any doubt at all. The estate was described in the document. Land extending across the valley north of the Millhaven town limits, several hundred acres in total, the measurement given in the older unit of rods that Clara had to work through slowly. Structures including the main hall, the ancillary buildings, and the underground storage works, plural, not one room, but several. Deposits of investment instruments, gold currency of varying denomination, and certain other valuables the specific nature of which were recorded in the attached inventory. There was no attached inventory, at least not in the leather case. Clara went through every sheet carefully and found no inventory. But the will referenced it, referred back to it repeatedly, said that the scope of the estate and the value of its holdings were detailed in full within the document appended hereto. She looked at the bottom of the last sheet and found a faint impression in the paper, a rectangle where something had once been fastened. The inventory had been attached. It was no longer there. Clara sat down on the edge of the foundation and opened the leather case again. She read more carefully this time, working through the formal language with the same patience she brought to everything, the patience of someone who had learned that most things worth understanding required you to slow down and pay close attention. The will was dated, not recent. The date at the top was over 90 years old, written in a hand that was firm and clear and not at all uncertain. Edwardine Josephine Calder had been certain. That much came through the old ink without any doubt at all. The estate was described in the document. Land extending across the valley north of the Millhaven town limits, several hundred acres in total, the measurement given in the older unit of rods that Clara had to work through slowly. Structures including the main hall, the ancillary buildings, and the underground storage works, plural, not one room, but several. Deposits of investment instruments, gold currency of varying denomination, and certain other valuables the specific nature of which were recorded in the attached inventory. There was no attached inventory, at least not in the leather case. Clara went through every sheet carefully and found no inventory. But the will referenced it, referred back to it repeatedly, said that the scope of the estate and the value of its holdings were detailed in full within the document appended hereto. She looked at the bottom of the last sheet and found a faint impression in the paper, a rectangle where something had once been fastened. The inventory had been attached. It was no longer there. Gone where, and when, and by whose hand? These were questions Clara filed carefully in the back of her mind and did not push on yet. She put the documents back in the case and looked up at the sky. The light had changed while she had been underground. It was later than she had thought. The pale winter sun was already tilting toward the tree line, and the air had the particular sharpness that comes in the hour before dark in cold weather. She needed to get back. Mrs. Dillard did bed check at 7, and if Clara was not in her bunk, there would be questions, searches, possibly calls to the county office that administered Hargrove House. The last thing she needed right now was county involvement. She stood, adjusted the tote bag on her shoulder, and looked at the foundation one more time. The stone steps descended into the room below. The boxes and jars were still there in the dark, still waiting. She had not opened them all. She had not, she realized, even touched most of what was on those shelves. She would come back tomorrow, and the day after. She made herself turn away from the clearing and walk back into the trees, following her own footprints in the soft ground. The forest was darker now, the light falling in narrower columns, and she moved faster than she had on the way out, not running but walking with purpose, her eyes tracking the return path with the same attention she had given the coin trail. She was halfway back when she found the 19th coin. It was sitting on top of a rock, not buried, not wedged in roots, just sitting there on the flat surface as if it had been placed moments ago. Clara stopped and looked at it, then looked at the trees around her. Nothing moved. Nothing made any sound except the wind in the high branches. She picked up the coin and put it in her pocket. The trees accepted her departure the same way they had accepted her arrival, without ceremony, without comment. She emerged at the tree line behind Hargrove House in the early evening dark with mud on her boots and the leather case in her tote bag and 27 coins in her pocket. Through the windows of the house, she could see the kitchen light on, the shape of Mrs. Calloway moving past the window, the flickering blue of a television in the common room. Clara cleaned her boots on the back steps before she went inside. She hung her coat on its hook and carried the tote bag upstairs and slid it under her bunk beside the loose board. She lay on her bunk with her hands behind her head and stared at the ceiling while the sounds of Hargrove House went on around her. The television, voices in the hallway, the clatter of supper being set out. Nobody had noticed she was gone. Nobody asked where she had been. Nobody would have cared. And for the first time in 4 years, Clara found herself grateful for the invisibility she usually only endured. She had a will. She had a name. She had a trail of coins and a stone room in the forest and a foundation with a carved name that matched the name on the documents in her bag. She had, somewhere at the end of something she could not yet see clearly, a fortune that someone had deliberately hidden and deliberately marked a path to. A fortune that whoever wrote the will had intended for a finder. She had found it. The question now was what it meant, what it was worth, who else knew about it, and whether a girl who had nothing and was nobody and lived in a house where they made pirate sounds at her when she came through the door could actually claim it. She thought about the coins under the loose board, 27 of them now in the handkerchief, each one solid and real and undeniable. She thought about the will in the leather case, old and formal and specific, its language strange but its intention clear. She thought about the stone steps descending into the dark in the boxes on the shelves that she had not yet opened. Whatever was down there had been waiting long enough. It could wait one more night. Clara closed her eyes and listened to the house settle around her and thought about a woman named Edwardine Josephine Calder who had lived 90 years ago and built something in a forest and left it for a finder, and she wondered whether this woman had ever imagined that the finder would be an 11-year-old girl who ate oatmeal alone on her birthday and kept her treasures under a loose floorboard. She thought probably not, but she had built the trail anyway. She had put the coins in the earth and the markers in the ground and the will in its leather case, and she had waited with the patience of stone for someone stubborn and quiet and attentive enough to follow the line to its end. Clara turned onto her side and pulled her blanket up to her chin. Outside, the wind moved through the trees at the edge of Hargrove House, and in the forest beyond, the clearing stood quiet in the dark, the foundation solid in the cold ground, the stone steps leading down into the waiting room where the boxes sat undisturbed on their shelves, full of whatever they had been full of for nearly a century. She would go back in the morning. She was sure of that the way she was sure of very few things. The way she was sure the coin trail had been deliberate, that the document in her bag was real, that the name carved in stone at the edge of the clearing was not a coincidence. She was sure with the particular certainty of someone who has been told their whole life that they are nothing and has found, in the dirt and the cold and the long silence of a forest, the first evidence that someone believed otherwise before they were even born. The house creaked around her. The radiator ticked. Someone in the room beside hers said something in sleep. Clara kept her eyes closed and her mind fixed on the image of the room below the clearing, the shelves, the boxes, the dry, cool air that had kept everything intact for nearly 100 years. On the leather case and the will inside it, and the words she had read and reread until they sat in her memory with the weight of the coins in her pocket. To the finder who follows the true path to its source. She pressed her thumb against the coin in her fist, the one she had found on the rock on the way home. She traced the outline of the bird on its face in the dark. She was the finder. Whatever came next would follow from that. She thought about her grandmother for a while, which was something she did not do often because it hurt in a way that the usual loneliness of Hargrove House did not. Her grandmother's name had been Iris, and she had been small and deliberate and had smelled of lavender and coffee. She had kept Clara from the age of 3 after Clara's mother had made a series of decisions that left no room for a child in their wake. Iris had not been rich or well-connected or knowledgeable about the kind of legal machinery that would have been useful in a situation like the one Clara was now standing in the middle of. She had been a retired seamstress in a 2-room apartment who made her granddaughter read aloud every evening from whatever book the library would lend them. She had died of a stroke in the middle of a Tuesday when Clara was 7, leaving her with no other family to speak of and a county welfare system that had done what county welfare systems do. Clara did not think Iris would have believed this story. She had been a practical woman who did not put stock in the extraordinary. But Clara thought she would have listened, and she would have looked at the coins, and after a long silence, she would have said something brief and grounding and entirely her own, the kind of thing that cut through confusion and left only the essential question standing. The essential question was, what do you do now? Clara knew she could not do this alone. That much was clear even to an 11-year-old sitting in a clearing in the forest. She had a will that was 90 years old. She had coins that were unusual enough to be significant, but that she could not value herself. She had a cleared clearing with a stone foundation and a hidden room and shelves full of boxes she had not yet opened. She had no money, no phone of her own, no adult she fully trusted, and no legal standing to claim anything. She was a ward of the state. Everything she found technically had to be reported. But to whom, and when, and in what order she reported it, those things mattered enormously. She had understood that much from the books she read, from the way the world in those books worked, from the quiet observations she had made over 4 years at Hargrove House about who held power and how they used it. If she walked up to Mrs. Dillard tonight and handed her the leather case, the will would disappear into county bureaucracy before the week was out. The coins would be cataloged as found property and turned over to some office. The clearing in the forest would become something to be assessed and managed by people with clipboards who had no connection to the name carved in the stone post. She needed someone who understood what she had found, someone who could not be bought or managed away, someone who would believe an 11-year-old girl from a state home who had followed a coin trail through a forest and come back with a 100-year-old will in her bag. She held that thought and let it hold her back and let the sounds of the house fade into something distant and unimportant, and she slept. She dreamed of the forest, not the cold November forest with its pale light and bare branches, but something warmer, the same trees in full leaf, the canopy dense and green, the clearing bright with summer sun. In the dream the foundation was whole, the walls standing, the building complete with windows lit from within and smoke rising from a chimney she could not see. She stood at the edge of the clearing and watched a woman in the window, old but upright, looking out at the trees with an expression Clara could not read from that distance. The woman turned toward her. Clara wanted to move forward, wanted to cross the clearing and come closer, but her feet would not cooperate. Or perhaps the clearing was wider in the dream than it was in the real world, the distance between the trees and the building always staying the same no matter how many steps she took. The woman lifted one hand and pressed it flat against the glass. Clara woke up. The room was dark, the house quiet, the radiator ticking its slow tick. She lay still for a moment with the dream still close around her, the image of the woman in the window still clear. Then she reached under the blanket where she had put the coin before sleeping and closed her fingers around it. Cold, solid, real. She would go back in the morning, she had said. She had meant it. But lying there in the dark of Hargrove House with the dream of Calder Hall still vivid behind her eyes, she felt something sharpen in her chest that went beyond simple resolve. It was the particular feeling of a door that has been standing shut for a very long time beginning to open. Not swinging wide, not yet, but shifting, the hinges yielding to the first real pressure they had felt in years. She did not know yet what the boxes on those shelves contained. She did not know what the missing inventory described. She did not know what several hundred acres of land in Millhaven Valley was worth or what structures the document had meant when it said the main hall and the ancillary buildings. She did not know how a will that was 90 years old worked in the present world, whether its terms would still hold, whether there was a court somewhere that would hear the claim of a child from a state home who had no money and no family and no standing except the trail of coins she had followed to its end. She did not know any of those things. But she knew she had been patient for 4 years at Hargrove House. Patient. Through the oatmeal breakfasts, and the missing button and the pirate sounds in the hallway. Patient through the invisibility and the cold, and the small daily reminders that she was no one's priority and no one's first thought. If Edwardine Josephine Calder could wait 90 years, Clara could wait one more morning. She pressed the coin once more and closed her eyes. She was back in the forest by 7 the next morning. She had told no one. She had eaten breakfast at the usual hour, washed her bowl, hung her coat on her hook in a deliberate show of ordinary routine, and then waited until Mrs. Calloway's attention was fixed on the stove and the older girls were still upstairs before she collected the tote bag from under her bunk and slipped out the back door. The morning was gray and cold, the kind of cold that settles in your ears and the backs of your hands. She had put on 2 pairs of socks and tucked her jeans into her boot tops and brought the flashlight with fresh batteries she had swapped from the emergency drawer in the kitchen hallway, the one Mrs. Dillard never checked. The forest received her the same as always. The trees were still bare, and the ground was soft from overnight frost thawing, and the light was the same filtered silver it always was at this hour. She moved faster than she had the day before, because she knew the route now, knew the distance between the markers and the rhythm of the ground. She did not stop to check for coins on the way in, though she noticed one wedged in the roots of a tree she passed, and noted its position without pausing. She could come back for it. Right now she had somewhere to be. The clearing opened in front of her after about 40 minutes of walking, which was faster than she had managed the day before. The foundation stood the same as she had left it, the stone post with its carved name visible through the dead grass at the far edge, the structure solid and patient in the gray morning light. She crossed to the steps without stopping and went down. The room was exactly as she had left it. This should not have surprised her, since she had been gone less than 20 hours and nothing lived down here to disturb things. But it still gave her a particular feeling to see the boxes and jars on the shelf in precisely the same arrangement, the leather case tucked into the tote bag on her back exactly as she had carried it out. The room had been waiting. That was the only word for it. Waiting, the way old things wait, without impatience, without doubt, simply holding their position until whatever was supposed to happen next arrived to happen. Clara set her bag down and clicked the flashlight on and went to work. She started with the boxes whose clasps she had not been able to move the day before. She had brought a small screwdriver from the tool shelf in the Hargrove House back hallway, another thing she would need to return before it was missed. She worked the tip of the screwdriver under each rusted clasp and applied steady pressure, not sudden force, but the sustained pressure of someone who understood that most things yielded eventually to patience rather than violence. The first clasp took 4 minutes. It came free with a grating complaint of rust, and she lifted the lid. Inside, on the same faded cloth lining she had seen in the other boxes, lay coins. More of the same type she had been finding in the forest, but cleaner than the outdoor ones, their surfaces dark with age but without the additional damage of weather and soil. She counted them without touching. 43 coins in this box alone. She closed the lid and moved to the next. The second box held something different. She opened it and found, packed in cloth that had once been white and was now the color of old paper, a collection of small flat objects. She lifted one carefully and brought it to the flashlight. It was a tile, roughly square, about 2 inches across, made of something that felt like ceramic but denser, heavier. On its face was an image, painted in colors that had faded but not vanished. A building with tall windows and a circular drive, surrounded by trees, a sky above it that had once been blue. She lifted another tile and found a different image. A room interior, formal furniture, a fireplace, tall ceilings. Another, a garden, formal plantings, a path leading to an iron gate. Another, a man's profile, stern and formal, in what looked like 19th century clothing. She went through the entire box. 18 tiles in total, each one a different image, each one depicting some part of what she understood, from context and from the will, to be Calder Hall. Not the ruined foundation she was standing beneath, but the complete building, intact and inhabited, recorded in miniature by someone who had wanted it remembered. She set the tiles aside with care and opened the third box. Documents. Folded papers, many of them, packed in tight. She opened the topmost one and found a deed, written in the same formal language as the will but older, dated in the 1880s, describing a transfer of land from one Hector Ambrose Calder to his wife, Josephine Marate Calder, of 340 acres of land in the valley north of Millhaven Township. Clara did the arithmetic in her head, imprecisely, but 340 acres in a valley that was now substantially developed would be worth something very significant. She set the deed aside and opened the next document. A letter, written in a different hand from the will, older, more ornate, the ink brown with age. She read it slowly, working through the formal address and the elaborate opening courtesies that the period demanded before any actual content appeared. When she reached the substance, she stopped and read it again. The letter was from a bank, or rather, from a private financial institution, the Calder Family Trust Account, written to Edwardine Josephine Calder in the year 1931. It referenced the existing account balance, which Clara had to read 3 times because the number seemed impossible. $260,000 in the year 1931 in gold-backed currency, held in a private account in the family's name. The letter noted that per the standing instructions attached to the account, the balance and all accrued interest would remain held in trust, inaccessible and unreported, until claimed by the account holder or the account holder's designated heir. Clara lowered the letter and sat very still in the underground dark. Gold-backed currency from 1931, held in a private trust for 9 decades. She was 11 years old, and she had never studied compound interest in school yet, but she understood the concept from the books she read, understood that money left to grow for long enough became something dramatically larger than it started as. She did not know how to calculate what $260,000 in 1931 would be worth today after 90 years of sitting untouched in a private account. But she suspected the number would be large enough to change everything she thought she understood about her own life. She put the letter carefully with the deed and continued through the box. There were more financial documents. Account statements from different years, each one referencing the same trust. 1938, 1944, 1951. Each statement showed the balance grown from the last, the interest accumulating on itself in the patient arithmetic of time. By 1951, the balance shown was already over $400,000. She did not find a more recent statement, but the pattern was clear enough. At the bottom of the document box, she found something that had been wrapped separately in cloth that had held together better than most of what surrounded it. She unwrapped it carefully and found a notebook, small, leather-covered, its pages thin but intact. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was Edwardine Josephine Calder's. She recognized it now from the will. But this was different from the formal legal language of the will. This was personal, conversational, the handwriting of someone talking to themselves or to someone they trusted absolutely. August 14th, 1947. I am old now, and I will not pretend otherwise. The house has been closed for 11 years, and I have no intention of reopening it. There is no one left to open it for, or so everyone assumes. I do not correct them. Let them assume what they like. The truth is that there will be someone, in time, because I have made certain of it. Not through the usual arrangements of wills and lawyers and courts and the endless machinery of official inheritance, which is too easily corrupted by too many hands, but through a simpler arrangement. A trail that only a finder deserves to follow. A test that is also a gift. The coins are in the ground. The markers stand. The documents are in the repository below what remains of the hall. I have spent 30 years putting this in order, and I am satisfied that it is right. Clara read slowly, turning each page with the kind of care she brought to old things. August 29th, 1947. I have been thinking about who the finder might be. It occurs to me that I cannot know and should not try to know. The trail will find the right person because the right person is, by definition, the one willing and capable of following it. I think of this as a self-selecting arrangement. The careless will not bother. The greedy will not have the patience. The fearful will turn back at the tree line. The right person will walk through, will pay attention, will follow a line of coins through a forest, and understand that what the coins point to is real and worth finding. I do not know this person's name. I do not know their age or their circumstances. I know only that they will have earned it, in whatever private way such things are earned. Clara looked up from the notebook at the room around her. The boxes on the shelf. The jar she had not yet opened. The dry stone walls. She was the person Edwardine had been writing about. the person she had been imagining across the years. The person with enough patience and enough stubbornness and enough nothing to lose to follow a line of coins through a forest and not turn back. She read to the end of the notebook. Most of it was the private accounting of an old woman's last years, the winding down of a life, the settling of accounts both financial and personal. There were passages about regret and about the ways that wealth had isolated her family as often as it had helped them. There were passages about the estate, about the difficulty of maintaining it through the Depression years, about the decision to close it and let the forest reclaim the grounds rather than sell it to someone who would not understand what it was. There was a passage near the end, dated 1949, that stopped Clara entirely. September 3rd, 1949. I have been told the total value of the trust account now exceeds $3 million. An accounting I find both remarkable and absurd given that the money was placed there to protect it and has done nothing but sit and grow in the dark like a root. My solicitor believes I should formalize the estate arrangements through official channels, file the necessary documents with the county, name a specific heir, and be done with it. I have refused. An heir named in a document is an heir that powerful people can contest and delay and circumvent. A finder who arrives with the coins in hand and the will from the repository has something that cannot be taken away by lawyers arguing over the meaning of old language, because the language is not old and the will is not ambiguous. It says what it says, and it says it clearly. I am content with this. $3 million in 1949. Clara thought about that number and what it had been doing for the 75 years since. She pressed her palms flat on the cold earth floor and breathed steadily and told herself to stay calm, which was advice she had given herself before in smaller circumstances and which had always been good advice. She opened the glass jars. The first contained rolled documents, protected from moisture by the glass. She unstoppered the metal lid carefully and withdrew the rolled papers and spread them on the floor with coins holding their edges flat. They were maps. Detailed hand-drawn maps of the estate grounds, showing the layout of the buildings and the paths and the forest and the borders of the land. She found the clearing immediately, the foundation labeled in Edwardines handwriting as the repository, and around it the surrounding land labeled with measurements and descriptions. To the north, 300 meters, the arrow pointing deeper into the forest, a notation, primary vault, underground, steel-lined, coordinates appended. The notation had a number beside it, but the map did not explain what the primary vault contained. A primary vault, a different space, deeper in the forest, steel-lined. Clara looked at the map and traced the route from the repository to the coordinates marked. She would need to find it. Whatever was in the primary vault, it was separate from what she was looking at here, and Edwardine had been deliberate about keeping the two things distinct. The second jar held coins of a different type. Not the estate coins she had been following, but older ones. Gold coins, she was nearly certain, the kind that the history books showed when they discussed the currency of the 19th century and earlier. She appended the jar carefully over her palm and let several slide out and held them to the flashlight. They were heavy in a way that felt final, the way very dense things feel, as if they have no interest in being anything other than exactly what they are. One face bore a date, 1863. Another, 1841. Another, 1877. She counted those she could see inside the jar without disturbing them. At least 30. Maybe more. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The third jar held nothing she could see. She held the flashlight against the glass and the contents remained dark, which meant either the jar was empty or it held something dark-colored. She tried the lid. It was stiff, sealed with wax that had hardened to the consistency of old plastic. She worked at it for several minutes before the lid broke free with a soft crack, and then the smell reached her before anything else. Paper. Old paper, the particular dry, slightly sweet scent of paper that has been sealed away from air for a very long time. She reached inside and withdrew a folded document. It was a stock certificate, issued in 1912 by the Calder Valley Land and Mining Company, in the name of Edwardine Josephine Calder. She counted the number of shares. She read it again. She set it down carefully and reached back into the jar and found more. Not one certificate, but a bundle of them, different companies, different years spanning from the early 1900s through the 1930s. A railroad, a copper concern, a manufacturing company whose name she recognized because it still existed, was in fact one of the largest companies of its kind in the country. The number of shares was not enormous by modern standards, but the value of those shares over a century of holding was a calculation she could not do in her head. She sat back against the wall and looked at everything she had spread out on the floor in the beam of the flashlight. The documents, the tiles, the financial records, the notebook, the gold coins, the stock certificates, and the knowledge, sitting in her chest like something solid, that there was a primary vault somewhere further in the forest that she had not yet reached. She was not sure, and would not be sure until she could find someone capable of calculating these things. But she thought the number she was sitting in the middle of might be very large. Not the kind of large that she could imagine in terms of her own life. Not the kind of large that would make sense when held up against oatmeal breakfasts and missing coat buttons and $42 a month. The kind of large that required a different vocabulary entirely. She thought about the bank letter. $260,000 in 1931, held untouched in a private account for 90 years with compounding interest. She had read enough in library books to know that something like that, depending on the rate and the arrangement, could become many times its original value. $3 million by 1949, Edward Dean had noted. Then what by now? She packed everything back carefully, matching each item to the space it had come from. The tiles back in their box. The documents folded and replaced. The notebook returned to its cloth wrapping. The coins back in their jar. She did not take anything except the leather case with the will, which was already in her tote bag, and the notebook, which she wrapped in an extra sock she had in her bag and tucked alongside the will. She closed everything else and left it as she had found it. Then she sat on the bottom step and thought. She needed help. She had known this since the night before, but she had been carrying it as an abstract. Knowledge, the way you carry a weight you have not yet decided how to set down. Now it was specific. She needed someone who could read the documents and understand what they said. Someone who could look at the stock certificates and the financial records and tell her what the numbers meant in the present world. Someone who knew how old wills worked, whether 90 years of waiting had voided anything or whether the terms still held. Someone who could not be bought, managed, or frightened by whatever forces might eventually emerge to contest a claim that, when it was known, would be contested hard. She thought about the people she knew. Mrs. Dillard, who was overworked and procedurally minded and would file everything with the county within 48 hours. Mrs. Calloway, who was kind enough but incapable of discretion. Mr. Foss, the Thursday reading volunteer, who was gentle and well-meaning and completely out of his depth with anything legal or financial. Renata, which was not a thought she entertained for more than a second. The librarian, Mrs. Haas, who had watched Clara carry the numismatics book to the table without asking questions. She stayed with that thought. Mrs. Haas was 63 years old and had been the Millhaven town librarian for 31 years. She had worked at the county law library for 12 years before that, and before that had studied historical research at a university whose name Clara had once read on the small frame diploma on the library wall. She was not a lawyer. She was not a financial advisor. But she was someone who had spent 40 years working with documents and records and the kind of accumulated paper evidence that gives the past its legal texture. She was someone who had watched Clara quietly over the years without making her feel observed. And she was someone whose eyes, when Clara had brought the coin to the library table and compared it to the numismatics book, had tracked the motion with a sharpness that had not been indifferent. Clara had not told Mrs. Haas about the coin that day, but Mrs. Haas had seen it. She climbed back up the stairs into the gray morning light and walked home through the forest with the notebook and the leather case in her tote bag, and her mind already running ahead to the conversation she needed to have, turning it over and over, finding the right words, the right order of revealing things. She had learned a long time ago that the order in which you said things determined, more than the things themselves, whether someone believed you. She reached the tree line behind Hargrove House at 9:15. Through the kitchen window, she could see Mrs. Calloway starting on the lunch preparations. The older girls were still not visible, which meant they were upstairs. Clara went through the back door and up to her room and put the tote bag under the loose board in the floor, and then went back downstairs and appeared in the kitchen doorway looking, she hoped, like a person who had simply been in her room reading. Mrs. Calloway barely looked up. Clara offered to peel potatoes and was handed a peeler and a bag and set to work beside the sink. She peeled potatoes and thought about Edwardine Josephine Calder and the primary vault and the route marked on the map that she had memorized before packing it back into its jar. She thought about what steel line meant in the context of an underground space that had been sealed for most of a century. She thought about what might be inside something like that. What a woman who had packed away stock certificates and gold coins and family documents into a stone room beneath a forest clearing had considered important enough to put in an even more secure location deeper still. She thought about 340 acres of land in the valley north of Millhaven. She had walked across parts of that land this morning and the morning before. She had felt its ground under her boots and put her hand on its stone. She did not know yet how to translate that into anything real, but she intended to find out. After lunch, she asked Mrs. Dillard if she could walk to the library. This was not unusual. Clara had been making the walk to the library once or twice a week since she arrived at Hargrove House. It was 1.5 miles each way, through town, along streets she knew well. Mrs. Dillard said yes and reminded her to be back by 5 o'clock and did not ask what she was going for, because Clara never gave her reason to ask. The walk to the library took 25 minutes at a steady pace. The town looked the same as it always did, quiet and slightly worn, the hardware store with its window display of snow shovels, the diner with its handwritten specials board, the post office with its flag at half-staff for a reason nobody had posted. Clara walked the familiar route and planned her words. The library was warm and smelled of old books and Mrs. Haas's particular brand of hand cream, something floral that Clara had come to associate with safety the way animals associate scents with territory. Mrs. Haas was at the returns desk when Clara came in, sorting a stack of books with the quick efficiency of someone who has done the same task 10,000 times and requires no thought for it. She looked up when the door opened and gave Clara the same small nod she gave all regular visitors. Clara selected a table near the back, away from the 2 other patrons present, a man reading a newspaper and an older woman with a laptop who had not looked up from her screen since before Clara arrived. She sat down and waited. She had brought the leather case in her bag, the will inside it, and the notebook. She had not brought the coins, which were still in the knotted handkerchief under the loose floorboard. After a few minutes, Mrs. Haas appeared in the aisle between the shelves. She had a book in her hand that she was returning to its place, a perfectly ordinary task, and she set it in its slot and was turning to go when her eyes moved to Clara's table. Clara met her eyes directly. She did not say anything. She set the leather case on the table between them and put her hand on top of it. Mrs. Haas looked at her for a moment. Then she came and sat down in the chair across the table. "You found something," she said. It was not a question. Clara nodded. Mrs. Haas looked at the leather case. "May I?" Clara pushed it across the table. Mrs. Haas handled it carefully, the way someone handles things they recognize as old and significant. She examined the exterior first, the stitching, the leather, the clasp. Then she opened it and withdrew the will and unfolded it and read. She read it the way Clara had read it, slowly, without rushing, her lips not moving but her eyes tracking every line. She turned each page with the same deliberateness she gave the documents she worked with every day. When she reached the end, she went back to the beginning and read 2 specific passages again. Then she set the papers on the table and folded her hands on top of them and looked at Clara. "Where did you find this?" Clara told her. She told her everything, in the order she had decided on. The coins, the trail, the stone markers, the clearing, the carved name, the steps, the room, what the room contained. She did not rush. She did not perform emotion she did not feel. She spoke in the same even tone she used for everything, the tone that Renata called strange and Mrs. Dillard called composed, and that was simply, for Clara, the only way she knew how to be. Mrs. Haas listened without interrupting. When Clara finished, there was a silence of about 10 seconds in which the library went on being what it was around them. The man turning his newspaper, the woman typing at her laptop, the books in their rows. "You walked into the forest alone," Mrs. Haas said finally. It was not quite a rebuke, but not quite not one either. "I needed to know what was there before I told anyone about it," Clara said. "If I had told Mrs. Dillard first, it would have gone to the county." Mrs. Haas looked at her steadily. "That may still have to happen. I know, but not until we understand what it is." Clara had said it without deciding to. and she felt the word land in the space between them and watched Mrs. Haas hear it. The librarian looked down at the will on the table. She turned it over and looked at the notarization on the back page, the official stamps and signatures of a notary who had died decades ago, but whose seal was still legible. "This is a valid legal document," Mrs. Haas said quietly, not to Clara but to the will itself, or perhaps to the room. "This is a properly executed will with appropriate witnesses and notarization. The date is consistent with the paper stock and the ink degradation." She looked up. "Where did you study law?" "I haven't." "Then how do you know it's real?" "It felt real," Clara said. "And the coins are real. I have 27 of them." Mrs. Haas was quiet for a moment. "Edwardine Calder," she said slowly. "I know that name. Not personally. But there's a local history collection in the back of this library that I cataloged when I first took this position 31 years ago. There are references to the Calder family. They were significant landowners in this valley for most of the 19th century. The family died out, or was assumed to have died out, sometime in the late 1940s. She paused. Where the last member was assumed to have died without an heir. "She left the estate to a finder," Clara said. Mrs. Haas looked at the leather case. She looked at Clara. She looked, finally, at the notebook that Clara had placed on the table beside the case. "May I?" she said again. Clara slid the notebook across. Mrs. Haas read it with the same patient attention she had given the will. The library patrons came and went around them. The afternoon light moved through the windows. At some point, Mrs. Haas got up quietly and went to the door and turned the lock and put up the closed sign, which she had never done in the middle of an afternoon in Clara's memory. She came back and sat down and continued reading. When she finished the notebook, she sat for a long time with her hands flat on the table. "She was writing about you," she said. "She didn't know you. She didn't know anyone. But she was writing about whoever would come, and she wrote as if she trusted them completely." She looked at Clara with an expression that Clara could not immediately identify. It was too layered, something careful, and something stirred. She wrote, "The right person will have earned it in whatever private way such things are earned." "I read that part," Clara said. "How long have you been at Hargrove House?" "For years. And before that?" "With my grandmother. She died when I was 7. Mrs. Haas looked at her for a moment. Then she pulled a notepad from the pocket of her cardigan and uncapped the pen. "I need to make some calls. Not to the county. Not yet. There is a woman I know, a retired probate attorney named Sylvia Marsh, who handled estate law in this region for 40 years before she retired. She does not frighten easily, and she cannot be pressured by county officials." She wrote down a name and a phone number and slid the notepad across to Clara. "I am also going to pull everything we have on the Calder family from the local history collection. If Edwardines will names the Calder estate and establishes you as the finder, the first thing any opposing party is going to do is challenge the estate's existence, argue that the land was absorbed into county holdings at some point in the last 9 decades, or claim the documents are forgeries. How do we stop them from doing that? We build the evidence before they know there's anything to build against." Mrs. Haas capped her pen. "Clara, I need to tell you something honestly." She paused. "What you've found, if the financial documents you've described are consistent with what I know about the Calder estate and its holdings, this is not a small matter. This is a very large matter. The kind of matter that attracts people who are skilled at making large things disappear into legal complexity before a child can get a foothold in them." "I know," Clara said. "Do you?" "I've been thinking about it since last night. If I go to the county too soon, the county calls a lawyer. The lawyer calls another lawyer. The estate gets frozen in a process that takes years. By the time it's finished, I'm 18 and in the system, and nobody remembers that I followed the trail first." Mrs. Haas looked at her with an expression that was clearer now. "You're 11 years old. I know. Most 11-year-olds don't think about legal processes in those terms. I read a lot." There was a pause in which Mrs. Haas looked at the will and the notebook on the table between them, and then out the window at the gray afternoon street, and then back at Clara, and something in her expression shifted, something that had been careful becoming something more decided. "I'll call Sylvia tonight," she said. "She'll want to see the documents. She'll want to see the coins. And she will absolutely want to see the repository in the forest." She hesitated. "Clara, the primary vault you mentioned, the one marked on the map. I haven't found it yet. When you do not open it alone. Take me with you." Clara thought about this. She had spent the last 3 weeks going alone into the forest and coming out alone with whatever she found, and the aloneness had felt protective, like a wall between the discovery and the world's ability to disrupt it. But she understood what Mrs. Haas was saying. The primary vault was deeper in the forest and contained something significant enough that Edwardine had used the word steel-lined. The kind of thing you wanted a witness for. The kind of thing you needed an adult to help you understand. Okay, she said. Mrs. Haas exhaled slowly. Good. She gathered the documents carefully and slid them back into the leather case and handed it to Clara. Keep this with you. Do not leave it at Hargrove House if you can help it. If Mrs. Dillard finds it, she has a legal obligation to report it, and that clock starts running. Clara tucked the case under her arm. What about the boxes in the repository? The gold coins and the stock certificates. Should I leave them there? For now, yes. The repository has held them for 90 years. It can hold them a few more days. What matters right now is the will, the notebook, and the contact with Sylvia. Mrs. Haas paused. And Clara, the people who will eventually come to contest this will not be gentle. When they find out that an 11-year-old girl from Hargrove House is claiming the Calder estate, they will use everything at their disposal to undermine your credibility and your legal standing. They will say you are too young to understand what you found. They will say you have been manipulated by adults with an interest in the estate. They will question the authenticity of the documents. They will call social services and argue that your welfare requires supervision, which means removing you from the equation. They'll try to put me somewhere while the lawyers argue, Clara said. Yes. They did that to Emma in a book I read. Mrs. Haas blinked. I'm sorry. Nothing. I just mean I've thought about it. Clara stood up and put the tote bag over her shoulder. When can you call Sylvia Marsh? Tonight. I'll call you at the house tomorrow morning. Ask for me by name and Mrs. Dillard will assume it's a library matter. She hesitated again. Clara, one more thing. The map coordinates you memorized. For the primary vault, can you reproduce them? Clara had memorized the coordinates the moment she saw them on the map in the jar. She had a memory for numbers that she had never been able to fully explain, the way certain minds grip numerical sequences the way others grip faces or melodies. She wrote the coordinates on Mrs. Haas's notepad without hesitation. Mrs. Haas looked at them. She pulled the notepad back and looked at them more carefully. She went to her own desk and came back with a road map of the county, the kind that folded out to show topographic lines as well as roads, and she found the relevant section and held the coordinates beside the map and traced the position with one finger. Her finger stopped. What is it? Clara asked. Mrs. Haas looked up from the map. Her expression had changed again, gone to something between disbelief and a particular careful steadiness, the face of someone controlling a reaction they have not yet decided how to name. These coordinates, she said, they don't point to the forest. Clara waited. They point to the forest and beyond it, to the valley on the other side of the ridge. She traced the line with her finger again. Clara, the land on the other side of that ridge is the Millhaven Valley Development Corridor. It was parceled and sold over the last 40 years to commercial developers. There are industrial properties there, warehouses, a distribution center, a quarry operation that has been running for 20 years. She paused. If the Calder estate boundary includes the land on that side of the ridge, and if those coordinates indicate the primary vault is in that area, then we are not simply talking about the value of the hidden repository in the forest. She looked at Clara with the map still open in her hands. We are potentially talking about land that has been developed, operated, and profited from for decades without the legal owner's knowledge or consent. Land that may have been sold fraudulently, because whoever sold it either did not know it belonged to the Calder estate or knew it and sold it anyway. Clara stood very still. How much is that land worth? She asked. Her voice came out steady, which she was quietly grateful for, because the rest of her was not entirely steady. Mrs. Haas looked back at the map. The development corridor alone, at current commercial rates, would be worth several $100 million. She set the map down on the table. But that's before you factor in the legal damages for unauthorized use, unauthorized development, and decades of commercial operation on land that was never legally available for sale. Clara sat back down. The library was quiet around them. The clock on the wall ticked. Through the front window, the gray afternoon street went on with its ordinary business. Clara thought about the morning she had eaten oatmeal alone on her birthday with nobody noticing. She thought about the missing button on her coat. She thought about Renata making pirate sounds in the hallway, and Mrs. Calloway saying poor little thing with a laugh that was not meant to be cruel, but was anyway. She thought about the 340 acres and the steel-lined vault and the bank letter from 1931. She thought about Edwardine Josephine Calder, old and deliberate in her last years, putting coins in the ground one by one along a path through a forest, writing in her notebook about a finder she would never know, trusting that the right person would come. Mrs. Haas was watching her. "Are you all right?" "Yes," Clara said. And she meant it. She was better than all right. She was something she had never had a word for before, which was certain. The particular certainty of a person who has stopped waiting for the world to notice them and has decided instead to act. "Call Sylvia Marsh tonight," she said. "I'll be here tomorrow morning at 9. She stood up, shouldered her tote bag, and walked to the door. Mrs. Haas had already moved to unlock it for her. They stood for a moment in the threshold between the library's warmth and the cold gray afternoon outside. "Clara," Mrs. Haas said, "don't tell anyone else." "Not yet." "I know," Clara said. She walked out into the street and started back toward Hargrove House, her boots on the cracked sidewalk, her breath white in the cold air, the leather case and the notebook in her bag, and 340 acres of contested valley land in her mind. She walked past the hardware store and the diner and the post office with its flag at half-staff, and she did not look like anyone unusual, just a quiet girl in a coat with a missing button walking home through a gray afternoon. But inside her something had shifted that would not shift back. The next morning brought Sylvia Marsh. Clara had expected a phone call and had prepared herself for the managed patience of waiting for arrangements to be made across a distance of days. But Mrs. Haas called at 8 in the morning as Clara was eating breakfast. And when Clara picked up the phone and said, "Hello, Mrs. Haas, it's the library," Mrs. Dillard raised no eyebrow. Sylvia Marsh was already in Mrs. Haas's car outside the library, having driven in from 2 towns over at 7 in the morning, because when Mrs. Haas had called her the night before and described what Clara had found, Sylvia Marsh had said, "I'll be there tomorrow," and hung up before Mrs. Haas could say anything further. Clara arrived at the library at 8:45. Sylvia Marsh was sitting at the back table where Clara usually sat, with the will and the notebook laid out in front of her, and 3 additional documents Clara had not seen before, printed pages that Sylvia had apparently brought with her. She was a small woman in her 70s, sharp-shouldered, with white hair cut short and eyes that moved quickly and settled with purpose. She was wearing a dark coat and sensible boots, and she looked like someone who had spent a career being underestimated by people who quickly stopped underestimating her. She looked up when Clara came in. She did not say "nice to meet you" or look at Clara with the particular soft sadness that adults often brought to their first encounter with a child from a state home, as if they were already sorry on her behalf for what her life must be like. She looked at Clara the way she had looked at the documents, directly and with the focused attention of someone taking inventory. "Sit down," she said. Clara sat. "I've read the will. I've read the notebook. Mrs. Haas showed me a transcription of the financial documents you described." Sylvia set her hands flat on the table. "The will is valid. Old, but valid. The notarization is authentic. I've verified the seal against records from the period. The terms are unusual, but legally coherent. A testamentary disposition to a finder, conditional on the finder presenting proof of passage via the trail established by the testator, is not unprecedented in estate law. It's rare, but it holds." Clara waited. "The land claim is more complicated," Sylvia continued, "specifically because of what Mrs. Haas told me about the development corridor and the coordinates of the primary vault. If those coordinates place the vault on land that has been commercially developed over the last 4 decades, we are dealing with a situation that goes well beyond a single estate inheritance." She paused. "Do you understand what I mean by adverse possession?" "No," Clara said honestly. "It's a legal doctrine that allows someone who has occupied or used land for a certain period to claim ownership of it under certain conditions. The people who develop that corridor may try to use it. They may argue that since the Calder estate was effectively abandoned and unclaimed for decades, their use of the land constitutes a form of ownership." She looked at Clara steadily. "They would be wrong, because the estate was not abandoned. It was held in trust, with a finder mechanism in place, which means it was legally occupied in the terms of the will even though no physical presence was maintained. But they will make the argument, and it will require serious legal work to defeat it." "How serious?" The kind of serious that involves significant resources, legal fees, expert witnesses, potentially years of litigation. Sylvia said it plainly, without apology. Which raises the question of how to fund the initial work before the estate's assets can be accessed. Clara thought about this. The coins in the repository, the gold coins from the jar. Would those be enough to cover initial costs? Sylvia looked at her for a moment. You know what those coins might be worth? Not exactly. But the book in this library says private mint coins from the early 20th century can be significant to collectors, particularly in complete sets. The 27 coins you found along the trail, Sylvia said, combined with what you describe in the repository boxes, could potentially constitute exactly that. A complete or near-complete set of Calder estate coins. I'd need to have them appraised by someone qualified, but if the set is intact, the collector value alone could be substantial enough to fund the initial filing. She picked up her pen. What I need from you now, Clara, is the following. I need you to take me to the repository today. I need to see the documents myself and assess the financial records firsthand. And I need you to tell me everything you remember about what was on that map in the jar. Specifically, everything you can recall about the boundaries of the land described. Clara opened her mouth to answer and then stopped. Something had moved at the edge of her attention. She turned and looked toward the front of the library, where through the window she could see the street. A car had stopped at the curb outside. Not parked, just stopped, engine running. A dark blue sedan with a small antenna on the roof that was the kind of detail that meant something specific if you had been reading the kinds of books Clara had been reading. She watched it for a moment. Then she looked back at Sylvia. Someone's outside, she said. They've been there since I arrived. Sylvia did not turn to look. She picked up her pen again and continued writing on her notepad as if Clara had said nothing about weather. How long ago did you find the coins? She asked, in a normal library voice. 3 weeks, Clara answered, at the same volume. And you've told no one except Mrs. Haas and me. No one? Then it's not about the discovery, Sylvia said quietly. It's about the land. Someone has been monitoring the Calder property boundary. She wrote something on her notepad and turned it to face Clara. It read, Someone already knows the estate exists and has been watching for a claimant. Clara looked at it. Then she looked back at the window. The dark blue sedan was still there. She thought about Edwardine Josephine Calder sitting in the forest in 1947 with her coins and her maps and her notebook, writing about the dangers of official channels and the value of a self-selecting trail that kept the discovery hidden until the finder was ready. She had known. Even then, decades before the development corridor existed, she had known that the estate would attract the attention of people with resources and the will to use them. She had built the trail specifically to route around them, to keep the discovery in private hands until the finder could establish an unassailable claim. Clara was the finder, but she was 11 years old and had no legal standing and no resources and was a ward of the state. She looked at Sylvia Marsh, who was still writing on her notepad with the focused calm of someone who had spent 40 years in rooms where the stakes were high and the other side had more lawyers. She looked at Mrs. Haas, who had turned the sign on the library door to closed again and was standing quietly by the reference shelf watching Clara with an expression that said clearly she understood what was happening and had already decided where she stood. And Clara, who had spent 4 years at Hargrove House learning the particular discipline of wanting things without letting the wanting show, felt something settle in her chest that was not quite hope and not quite certainty, but was the thing that lives between them. The thing that keeps you moving when everything says stop. The thing that follows a trail of coins through a cold forest on a birthday when nobody remembered and nobody came and the world was entirely quiet. The thing that finds what it's looking for. The dark sedan was still outside. Let it sit. She had work to do. And a part two. She had been 11 years old when she ate oatmeal alone on her birthday, and nobody in the building noticed, and the gray morning outside the window was just a gray morning, and the world held nothing particular for her. She had been 11 years old when she found the first coin in the dirt at the edge of the tree line and held it to the fading afternoon light and felt, for reasons she could not explain, that it had been waiting specifically for her. She had been 11 years old through all of it. The trail and the markers and the clearing and the underground room and the 90-year-old will and the notebook where Edwardine had written about a finder she trusted without knowing. None of that was gone. None of it was made smaller by the dark blue sedan at the curb or by the knowledge that there were people who had been watching the boundary of this land and waiting for someone to step forward. If anything, their watching only confirmed what Edwardine had written in her notebook in 1949. The people who stood to lose from this discovery had always been there, watching from the edges of what they had taken. They had been counting on the finder never coming. They had been counting on the trail going cold and the coins staying buried and the repository staying sealed and the primary vault staying hidden through another generation and then another until even the memory of the Calder estate was fully absorbed into the development corridor and the industrial properties and the 40 years of commercial operation that had proceeded without permission on land that had never been legally theirs. They had been wrong to count on that. Sylvia capped her pen and gathered the documents with practiced efficiency. She looked up at Clara, and something in her expression had a new quality, not warmth exactly, more the particular respect that one deliberate person gives another regardless of age. "The repository," she said. "Today, after dark is safer," Clara said. "There's less chance of being seen." Sylvia paused. Then she gave the smallest nod. "After dark, then. I'll bring a second flashlight." She looked at the window, at the sedan still idling outside. "You understand that once we file the initial claim, this becomes public record. The people watching right now will know immediately." "I know. And you're not afraid." Clara thought about how to answer this honestly. She was afraid in the way that anyone walking towards something large and uncertain is afraid, in the way that the word afraid carries more meanings than it can hold if you press it. She was afraid in some of the ways and not others. She was not afraid of the forest or the dark or the underground room. She was not afraid of legal proceedings or of being disbelieved. She was not afraid of being told she was nothing, because she had been told that for years and had gone on being whatever she was regardless. What she was afraid of, if she was honest, was what happened if they failed. Not to the inheritance, not to the estate, but to the feeling she had carried since the morning she picked up the first coin. The feeling of being the person Edwardine had been writing about, of having followed the trail to the end and found, in the dry, cool air of a hidden room, the evidence that someone had believed in a finder before the finder even existed. That feeling, whatever it was worth, she did not want to lose it. "I'm afraid of specific things," she told Sylvia, "not the general direction." Sylvia Marsh looked at her for a long moment. Then she picked up her bag and stood and straightened her coat. "Good," she said. "That's the right kind of afraid to be." They went after dark, the three of them. Sylvia Marsh had a proper flashlight, the kind that runs on heavy batteries and throws a beam wide enough to read by. Mrs. Haas brought a second one, smaller but steady, and a canvas bag with a thermos of coffee and a notebook for recording what they found. Clara brought the tote bag with the leather case and the notebook and the handkerchief of 27 coins, because Edwardine's will said the finder must present the coins as proof of passage, and she intended to be ready. They met at the back edge of Hargrove House's property at 8 in the evening, which was after bed check and after Mrs. Dillard had done her final round of the house and settled into her own room with the television she could hear faintly from the hall. Clara had gone to bed at the usual hour, lain flat on her back in the dark with her eyes open and her mind running through everything. And at 7:50, she had slid out from under her blanket with her clothes already on and her boots in her hand and moved down the back stairs in her socks, which was the only way to navigate that staircase without producing sound. The night was cold and clear. Stars were visible between the trees, the kind of cold-weather stars that look closer than they are, bright and specific, each one sharp-edged against the dark. She found Sylvia and Mrs. Haas waiting where she had said, their breath clouding in the beam of Sylvia's flashlight, both of them dressed for the cold with sensible practicality. Nobody said very much. They turned their lights on and walked into the forest. Clara led. She moved along the trail with the confidence she had built over 3 weeks of walking it, her feet finding the path by memory more than by sight. The stone markers emerged from the dark one after another, each one exactly where she expected it. Sylvia said nothing as they passed them, only observed, but she paused at the first one and crouched down and ran her gloved hand along the cut stone with the careful attention of someone noting something significant. The clearing appeared ahead of them after 40 minutes of walking, its open sky brighter than the canopy that had surrounded them, the dead grass silver in the starlight. The foundation stood at its center, solid and patient. The carved post at the far edge was visible from the tree line. Calder Hall. Clara watched Sylvia read it, watched her absorb the certainty of it, the deliberateness of those deep cuts in the granite that 90 years of weather had not softened. They went down the steps and into the repository. Sylvia moved through the room with systematic thoroughness, her light covering every surface. She examined the stone walls, the fitted blocks, the dry air that had kept everything intact. She opened the boxes one by one, the ones Clara had already opened and the ones she had not. The tiles she laid out on the floor in a line and studied each one. The documents she read with the same contained concentration she had brought to the will in the library, occasionally making a note in the small notebook she had brought. The gold coins from the jar she weighed in her palm and held to the light and set down carefully. Mrs. Haas documented. She photographed everything with a small camera she had brought, working methodically from shelf to floor to wall, building a photographic record of every item in its original position before anything was disturbed. She did not rush. She did not exclaim. She did the work of a trained researcher who understands that what can be proven in court is not what you saw, but what you recorded. Sylvia read the bank letter from 1931. She read the account statements from the subsequent decades. She read them all, in order, letting the arithmetic build in the silence of the underground room. And when she finished, she set them down and looked at the wall above them for a moment. The account described in these documents, she said, is a private family trust account established with a financial institution that no longer exists under that name, but whose records were absorbed into a regional bank consortium in the 1970s. Those records are legally traceable. She paused. If the account has been continuously held and the terms of the trust have been maintained, the balance at current compounding rates would be in the range of $60 to $80 million. Clara said nothing. She sat on the bottom step and let the number settle. That's before the land value, Sylvia continued. Before the development corridor claim. Before the gold coins and the stock certificates. She looked at the open boxes on the shelf. Before whatever is in the primary vault. Mrs. Haas looked up from her camera. The three of them looked at each other in the light of 3 flashlights in a dry stone room below a forest in the dark. The coordinates, Clara said. Sylvia had the map transcription in her jacket pocket. She pulled it out and held it with Clara's handwritten coordinates beside it. From here, the primary vault is approximately 280 meters north-northeast. Given the terrain shown in the topographic survey I pulled from the county records this afternoon, it should be in a depression below the ridge line, which would put it exactly at the boundary of what is now the development corridor. On the boundary, Clara said, or inside it. Sylvia folded the map back. On the boundary, technically in the forest, technically still within the undeveloped portion of the Calder land, but positioned so that its contents would have been accessible from both sides of the ridge. She put the map away. Edwardine was not careless about these things. They locked the repository behind them, pulling the stone door shut and covering the entrance with the mat of moss and leaf material that had once grown across it. They marked the coordinates in Sylvia's notes and started north-northeast through the dark forest with their flashlights cutting the shadows between the old trees. The ground changed as they moved further from the clearing. It sloped gently downward, and then more steeply, the kind of ridge descent that you feel in your ankles before you see it with your eyes. The trees here were enormous, wider trunked than those near the clearing, some of them clearly older than the estate itself. Oaks and maples whose roots buckled the ground into a terrain of small rises and hollows. It was quiet in the way that deep forest is quiet at night, a silence made of many small sounds, all below the threshold of intrusion. Mrs. Haas stopped first. There, she said. The flashlight beam had caught something metallic, a brief reflection from the ground 10 meters to their left. They moved toward it, and Clara's foot struck something solid just below the surface of the leaf cover. She crouched down and brushed away dead leaves with her gloved hand and found iron. Not natural iron. Worked iron, shaped and bolted. The corner of a door. It was set flush with the ground, nearly invisible under a decade of accumulated leaf fall. The iron was dark with rust at its edges, but the surface was intact, the seal around its perimeter showing a rubber gasket, dried and cracked, but still present, still attempting the task it had been put there for. A vault door, set horizontal in the earth, hinged on one side, with a locking mechanism on the other that was heavy and complex and unlike anything you would find on a domestic structure. This had been built by someone who understood the difference between keeping things safe and keeping things hidden. Sylvia crouched beside it. She examined the lock by flashlight, her expression focused and unreadable. "This is a Mosler mechanism," she said. "Late 1930s manufacture. They were used primarily for bank vault subsidiary storage and private institutional installations." She straightened up. "Do you have a key among the documents?" Clara had gone through every item in the repository carefully. She had found no key, but she thought about the coins. She thought about the will, which said the finder who presents the coins retrieved along the appointed trail. She crouched down beside the lock and brought her flashlight close. The lock face was circular, roughly 8 inches across, with a central aperture surrounded by a ring of smaller apertures, each one in a particular shape. Not a standard keyhole. Each aperture was roughly coin-sized and coin-shaped, but with specific interior profiles, the kind of shaped slots that only accept a specific object in a specific orientation. She counted the apertures. 27. She opened the handkerchief. 27 coins. Mrs. Haas made a sound that was not quite a word. Sylvia said nothing at all, only held her flashlight steady over Clara's hands as Clara, working slowly and carefully, began to fit each coin into its corresponding slot. The first went in with a resistance that yielded after a slight rotation. The second, the third. Each coin had a specific aperture size to its particular design. The bird coin in the bird-shaped slot, the house coin in the house-shaped slot, each image on the coin face matching an engraved guide mark beside each aperture. A mechanical puzzle that was also proof of passage. Edwardine had not only left coins in the ground. She had built the vault door to open only for someone who had collected them all. The 27th coin went in. Something inside the door shifted with a sound like deep stone grinding. Then a pause. Then a sound like pressure releasing, a long exhalation of sealed air escaping a space that had been closed for decades. The edge of the door rose slightly on its hinges, the gasket's grip finally broken, and a column of cold air emerged from the crack and moved across their hands. Sylvia and Clara took opposite sides of the door and lifted. The steel-lined vault was approximately the size of a small room, maybe 12 feet square, its walls and ceiling clad in steel panels bolted to a stone substrate. The air inside was cold and bone-dry, sealed by the gasket door against any moisture for the last 80-something years. Their flashlight beams moved across the contents, and for a moment, none of them spoke. The dominant feature was the shelving. Steel shelves bolted to the walls on 3 sides, floor to ceiling, packed with sealed steel containers, each one labeled in Edwardine's handwriting on a tag riveted to its front. Currency holdings. Bonds, Series A, bonds, Series B, equity certificates, domestic. Equity certificates, international. Gold reserve, primary. Gold reserve, secondary. Land instruments. Legal documentation, original. Legal documentation, copies. And at the far end of the room, on a shelf by itself, a single sealed container marked, for the finder. Personal. Sylvia moved to the financial containers first, working with the systematic efficiency of someone who had spent a career assessing the contents of estates. She opened the currency holdings container and found stacked bills, old but genuine, vacuum-sealed in clear wrapping that had kept them dry. She opened the bond series containers and found bundled certificates, their denominations and issue dates clearly printed on their faces, matured instruments from institutions that had survived in one form or another across the decades. She opened the equity certificate containers and found more stock certificates, far more than what was in the repository below, hundreds of certificates representing holdings in companies spanning the early and mid-20th century, some of the names still recognizable, some absorbed into larger entities whose current value was a matter of public record. She worked for 2 hours in that vault with her notebook and her camera and the practice speed of someone who understands that what she is looking at needs to be inventoried before it can be claimed. Mrs. Haas documented alongside her, photographing every container's label before and after opening, recording each item as it was revealed. Clara sat on the floor near the entrance and watched, and was very quiet and very still, and let herself feel what she was feeling, which was large enough that she was not sure it had a name. It was not happiness exactly, though happiness was part of it. It was not relief, though that was there too. It was something that sat at the center of all of it and had the quality of things that have been a very long time in coming, the particular weight of an ending that turns out to be a beginning. After 2 hours, Sylvia sat down on the floor across from Clara with her notebook on her knee and her flashlight propped against the wall between them. "I need to give you approximate numbers," she said, "because you are the finder, and this is yours and you deserve to hear it plainly." Clara nodded. "The bond certificates, at current matured value, are worth approximately $42 million. The equity certificates, based on the companies named and their current market positions, represent holdings with a current value of somewhere between $90 and $110 million. The gold reserves, at current spot price, are worth approximately $38 million. The trust account, which I can now access the full documentation for, stands at a current calculated value of approximately $74 million. She paused. The currency, because it is old issue, has numismatic value well above face value. Initial estimate, pending proper appraisal, somewhere between 8 and 15 million. Clara did the arithmetic in her head. That's over 250 million, she said. Before the land claim, Sylvia said. Before the legal damages for the unauthorized development of the corridor. Before the appraisal of the coin collection, which is complete and in extraordinary condition, and which I believe will fetch considerably more than we estimated this afternoon. She closed her notebook. Clara, the full value of the Calder estate, including the land claim and associated damages against the parties who developed and profited from that corridor without legal title, is somewhere in the range of $350 to $400 million. She said it the same way she said everything, without drama, without a pause for effect. Just the fact, stated plainly. $350 to $400 million. The vault was quiet around them. The steel walls held the cold, and the flashlight beams made the space feel close and private, just the three of them at the end of a trail that had started with a coin glinting in the afternoon light at the edge of a forest behind a state children's home. An 11-year-old girl in a coat with a missing button and a woman who spent her career reading documents and a retired librarian who had watched the girl carry a coin to a library table 3 weeks ago and known, without asking, that something was beginning. Clara looked at the container on the far shelf. For the finder. Personal. She got up and opened it. Inside was a letter, sealed in the same clear vacuum wrapping that had protected the currency. She broke the seal carefully and unfolded the paper with both hands. My dear finder, I do not know your name. I do not know your face or your age or the circumstances that brought you to this valley and this forest and this door. But I know something about you, because I built this trail for you, and only a specific kind of person follows a trail like this to its end. You are patient. You pay attention to things that others dismiss. You have held on to something inside yourself in difficult circumstances, and you have not let it be taken from you. I know this because anyone who lacks these qualities would have stopped somewhere along the way. They would have found the coins and pocketed them and gone home. They would have found the repository and been frightened by what it implied. They would have found this door and not known how to open it. But you are here. That tells me everything I need to know. I want you to understand something about this estate and what it means. The Calder family accumulated this wealth over several generations, and like all accumulated wealth, it came with shadows I will not pretend away. There are things my family did in building what they built that were not right, and the records of those things exist in this country and in the counties adjoining it if someone chooses to look. I am not asking you to carry those shadows. They are not yours to carry. What I am asking is this. Use what you find here to build something worth building. Not monuments to yourself. Not the kind of life that wealth makes easy and meaningless in equal measure. But something that does what this valley has always needed someone with enough resources to do. Fill the gaps that the official structures cannot or will not fill. The children who fall through the edges. The people without advocates. The places where patience and attention could change something real if they were paired with resources. You will know what that means better than I can specify. You followed a trail that I could only partly imagine to a destination I only partly designed. You will know what to build. The estate is yours. Spend it as if it means something. With the complete trust of a woman who chose carefully. Edwardine Josephine Calder, October 11th, 1951. Clara read it twice, and then folded it, and held it against her chest in the cold vault below the dark forest, and let herself sit for a moment in the particular stillness that follows something you have been moving toward for a long time finally arriving. The legal proceedings began the following week. Sylvia filed the initial estate claim with the probate court on a Thursday morning, presenting the will, the vault contents inventory, the photographic documentation, the coin collection as proof of passage, and a 300-page legal brief establishing the continuous validity of the Calder estate trust across 90 years of apparent abandonment. She filed simultaneously in county court, state court, and federal court, a layered filing strategy that Sylvia explained was designed to prevent any single jurisdiction from quietly stalling the matter while the other parties organized their response. The response, when it came, was exactly what Sylvia had predicted. The development corridor was owned by 3 separate commercial entities, all of them subsidiaries of a larger holding company called Meridian Valley Partners, headquartered 2 states away. Their lawyers arrived within 4 days of the filing, 4 of them in expensive suits with identical briefcases, and they filed their first motion to dismiss within a week, arguing precisely what Sylvia had told Clara they would argue, that the estate had been legally abandoned, that the will was too old and too unusual to be enforceable, that the child making the claim was too young to hold legal standing, and that the development of the corridor had proceeded in good faith based on county records that showed no surviving claimant. Sylvia had anticipated each of these arguments. She had been anticipating them for 30 years in various forms, because she had spent her career watching exactly these kinds of arguments deployed against estates whose rightful owners lacked the resources to fight back. She filed her responses with a methodical precision that left nothing open. The will was valid, and she had 3 independent legal experts to say so. The estate was not abandoned, but held in trust with a finder mechanism, a legally coherent arrangement she could demonstrate with precedents going back to the 18th century. Clara's legal standing was established through the will's own terms, which conferred standing on the finder regardless of age, and through a guardian ad litem appointment that Sylvia had arranged through a judge she had worked with for 20 years. And the good faith claim of Meridian Valley Partners, Sylvia's response argued with a precision that made it read almost like a statement of obvious fact, could not survive the discovery process, because the county records that Meridian's lawyers cited as their foundation for good faith had themselves been falsified. That last point was the one that changed everything. The county records showing no surviving Calder estate claim had been altered, not recently, not clumsily, but with the careful expertise of someone who understood how county land records worked and where the vulnerabilities were. Sylvia had found the alterations during the 3 weeks between the vault discovery and the filing, using her 40 years of experience with exactly this kind of document and her access through a former colleague to the original microfilm archives that predated the digital record. Someone had removed the Calder estate from the county land registry in 1971, for years before the first development permits for the corridor were issued. The removal was done in the records, but the original filing was preserved, as original filings always are, in the archive that most people never know exists and even fewer know how to access. When Sylvia presented this evidence in the first substantive hearing, the opposing lawyers went very quiet for a long time. The judge, a deliberate woman in her 60s named the Honorable Patricia Wren, who had spent 30 years on the estate bench and who had seen most of what the field had to offer, read the documentation Sylvia submitted without comment. She read the original county land filing. She read the falsified registry entry. She read the timeline that showed exactly how the corridor development had been permitted and executed in the gap created by the fraudulent removal of the Calder estate from the public record. She looked up at the opposing lawyers. She said, "I am going to need you to explain to this court who authorized the removal of this filing from the county record in 1971. And I am going to need you to explain it with documentation, not with arguments." They could not. The case ran for 6 months in total. 6 months of hearings and depositions and expert testimony and the particular grinding machinery of legal proceedings that is exhausting even to people who understand it and incomprehensible to those who don't. Sylvia navigated it with the patient endurance of someone who has never confused the pace of justice with the certainty of it. Mrs. Haas came to every hearing as Clara's informal companion and advocate, sitting beside her in the courtroom with the same quiet steadiness she brought to the reference desk. The guardian ad litem appointed by the court, a man named Thomas Reyes who had been doing the work for 15 years, turned out to be exactly the right person in exactly the right role, Someone who took the concept of the child's interests seriously enough to fight for them with paperwork rather than with sentiment. Renata found out when the first newspaper article ran. The article appeared in the regional paper 8 weeks into the proceedings, a careful piece by a journalist who had seen the court filings and understood what they meant. It did not name Clara directly, because Sylvia had worked with the reporter to ensure that the minor at the center of the claim was referred to only as the finder, a designation that was both legally appropriate and, as Sylvia noted quietly, quite accurate. But the reporter described the essential story in enough detail that anyone in Millhaven who read it would understand. A child from Hargrove House had found a hidden estate worth hundreds of millions of dollars by following a trail of old coins through the forest behind the children's home. Renata came to find Clara the morning the article ran. She knocked on Clara's door, which was a thing she had never done before, and when Clara opened it, Renata was standing in the hallway with the newspaper folded in her hand and an expression on her face that Clara could not immediately read because it contained too many things at once. "It's you, isn't it?" Renata said. It was not entirely a question. Clara waited. "The finder," Renata said. "The kid who found the estate. It's you." Clara thought about the pirate sounds in the hallway, and the treasure hunter, and the poor little thing from Mrs. Calloway, and the exaggerated searching gestures, and the months of being the punchline to a joke she had not asked to be part of. "Yes," she said. Renata stood in the hallway for a moment with the newspaper in her hand. Then she said, very quietly, "I'm sorry for the things I said. I didn't think." She paused. "I never think." It was not an eloquent apology. It was a 14-year-old's apology, clumsy and genuine in equal measure, and Clara thought that it cost Renata something real to stand in the hallway and say it, and that cost was worth acknowledging. "It's okay," Clara said, and she meant it, which surprised her slightly. The anger she had expected to feel was not there, or not in the form she would have predicted. What she felt instead was something more like the absence of the thing that had been there before, like a stone lifted from a pressure point you have stopped noticing because it has been there so long. Mrs. Dillard called Clara into her office 3 days after the article ran. She sat behind her desk with the newspaper and a printout of the court filing, and her reading glasses on, and her expression carrying the particular combination of professional composure and deep personal bewilderment of someone who has discovered that something extraordinary was happening in their building for months, and they were entirely unaware of it. She said several things that were not quite apologies, but were in the vicinity of apologies, the way things said by people in positions of institutional authority tend to circle around acknowledgement without landing on it directly. She said that she hoped Clara understood the house had always tried to provide what it could, that the resources available were never adequate for what the children needed, that if she had known, she would have tried harder to. Clara listened politely and thought about the morning nobody remembered her birthday and the oatmeal and the gray light through the window. "I know," she said, and she did know, which was the complicated part. Mrs. Dillard was not a bad person. She was an overworked person in an underfunded system doing what she could with what she had. The inadequacy was not personal. It was structural. And what Clara had found in the forest was, among other things, the means to do something about structural inadequacy in a way that a single overworked woman in a children's home never could. The final hearing was on a Tuesday in March, exactly 1 year after Clara had found the first coin in the dirt at the edge of the tree line. She had not planned the timing and did not notice it until she was sitting in the courtroom with Sylvia on one side and Thomas Reyes on the other, and Mrs. Haas in the row behind, and the Honorable Patricia Wren on the bench with the full record of the case spread in front of her. Judge Wren read her ruling from the bench. She was thorough, as she always was, moving through each contested point with the precision of someone who understands that written rulings become the legal foundation for everything that follows, and that imprecision now costs everyone later. She addressed the will's validity. She addressed the finder mechanism and its legal coherence. She addressed the falsification of the county land record in 1971 and the 3 individuals who had since been identified as responsible for it, one of whom was dead and 2 of whom had retired to other states and were currently the subjects of a separate fraud investigation by the state attorney general. She addressed the development corridor claim and the damages accrued by Meridian Valley Partners' decades of unauthorized operation on Calder land. Then she looked up from her papers and looked at the courtroom. The Calder estate, in its entirety as described in the will and vault documentation, is awarded to the finder as defined in the testamentary instrument executed by Edwardine Josephine Calder. The finder is Clara, a minor currently in the care of the state, whose legal standing to receive this award is established by the terms of the will and confirmed by this court. The estate will be held in supervised trust until the finder reaches majority, at which point full legal control will transfer. The trust will be administered by the guardian ad litem currently appointed, with the finder's input on all major decisions. She paused. The damages claim against Meridian Valley Partners and its subsidiaries is approved in principle and will proceed to a separate damages hearing. Initial assessment of damages is in the range of $120 million. She took off her reading glasses. This concludes the matter of the Calder estate claim. The courtroom was not silent. Behind Clara, she could hear the sound of several people drawing breath at once. The Meridian lawyers sat very still with the particular stillness of people absorbing something they had not prepared for despite being warned. Sylvia set her pen down on her notepad and folded her hands and said nothing at all. Clara sat in her chair and looked at the seal on the wall above Judge Wren's bench. A circular seal with the name of the county and an image of the valley landscape, the hills and the river and the trees, and she thought about the forest at the back of Hargrove House and the path she had walked through it 36 times since the first coin, and about a woman she had never met who had put those coins in the ground with a trust she had carried across decades and given to a stranger who turned out to be exactly the kind of stranger she had been imagining. The trust she'd been given was real. The numbers were real. $380 million was the final figure, announced 6 weeks later when the Meridian damages settlement was reached without going to a full damages hearing, because Meridian Valley Partners' legal exposure, once the fraud investigation was folded into the civil proceeding, was extensive enough that their lawyers recommended settlement over trial. $380 million. Clara sat with Sylvia and Thomas Reyes and Mrs. Haas the afternoon the settlement was finalized, and they told her the total, and she sat with it for a long time without speaking. Mrs. Haas, who had known her for a year now in a way that went well beyond librarian and patron, said, "What are you thinking?" Clara thought about what Edwardine had written. Use what you find here to build something worth building. The children who fall through the edges. The people without advocates. The places where patience and attention could change something real if they were paired with resources. "I want to build something," Clara said. "Before I do anything else. Before I move anywhere or change anything about where I live. I want to start building it now." What she built, over the following year and a half, with Sylvia managing the legal architecture and Mrs. Haas serving as the first board chair and Thomas Reyes ensuring the minor at the center of it all was protected at every step, was a foundation. It was called the Finder Foundation, which was a name Clara had chosen herself over several suggested alternatives that all sounded more formal and meant less. The Finder Foundation did 3 things. It funded legal advocacy for children in state care navigating the inheritance and property claim process, because Clara had discovered during her own proceedings that she was not the first child to find herself at the center of a legal claim she lacked the resources to pursue. Only the first one who had Sylvia Marsh on her side. It funded a program that paired stay-at-home children with mentors who had specific professional expertise, not life coaching, not therapy, but access to the specific knowledge that Clara had found in Mrs. Haas and that most children in her situation never encountered. And it funded a small endowment at the Millhaven Library in the name of the Calder family, because the library was where it had truly started and because the free and open availability of knowledge was, as Clara had said at the first board meeting, the actual beginning of every trail worth following. She moved out of Hargrove House 18 months after the ruling. Not immediately, which surprised people, but Clara had needed the time to understand what she was moving toward rather than just what she was leaving, and she had needed to ensure that the things she had started at the foundation were stable enough to continue without requiring her to be physically present every day. She moved to a small apartment on the north side of Millhaven, walking distance from the library, close enough to the forest that she could see the tree line from her kitchen window on clear days. Mrs. Haas came for dinner the first week. She brought bread and a bottle of sparkling cider and a small framed photograph that she set on the kitchen table without comment. Clara picked it up and looked at it. It was a photograph she had never seen, a formal portrait of an elderly woman, white-haired and straight-backed, with sharp eyes and an expression that was serious but not unkind. On the back, in Mrs. Haas's handwriting, was a note. This was in the local history collection, taken in 1947. She was 57. She had been watching over you longer than either of you knew. Clara set the photograph on the windowsill, where she could see it from the kitchen table. Outside, the March light was starting to carry warmth again after the long winter. The tree line at the north edge of town was just visible, the same bare branches that would be full and green in 2 months. Somewhere in those trees the path ran northeast through the old forest to the clearing where the stone post still stood with its carved name. And below the clearing the repository held its boxes and jars, and beyond the ridge the primary vault stood sealed again, waiting as it had always waited, with the door closed and the coins in their apertures, and the letter for the finder put back in its container. Some things you leave in the ground not because they are done with, but because they are complete. Edwardine had understood that. Clara was beginning to. She had turned 12 in the middle of the proceedings, in March, and this time people had noticed. Sylvia had brought a cake to the courthouse. Mrs. Haas had stayed late at the library with a small gathering of people who had come to matter in the year since the discovery. Renata had texted her, a thing that required Clara's phone number, which Renata had gotten from someone at Hargrove House, and had clearly thought about for days before sending, because the message was careful in a way that Clara recognized as someone trying to do better than they had done before. She had turned 12, and it had not been like turning 11. It had not been a gray morning and a bowl of oatmeal in a world that had nothing particular for her. It had been a beginning, which is what birthdays are supposed to be and so rarely manage. She had been nobody. She had lived in a house where they made pirate sounds at her when she came through the door. She had eaten breakfast alone and kept her treasures under a loose board and carried her private certainties in silence because the world she lived in had no use for them. She had followed a line of coins through a cold forest because she was too stubborn to turn back and too attentive to miss what the ground was telling her. And at the end of the trail there had been a vault, and in the vault there had been a letter, and the letter had said, "Use it as if it means something." She intended to. The Foundation's first grant went out on the anniversary of the day she found the first coin. She had arranged that deliberately, the date circled on her calendar in the same red marker she used for everything important. 12 children in 4 counties received their first access to legal representation in estate proceedings through the program. 6 of them were younger than she had been when she sat in a library and slid a leather case across a table to a woman who had been paying attention. 2 of them, she would learn later, had found things of their own. Not hidden vaults or trail coins, but things worth finding. Things that had been there all along, waiting for someone to stop dismissing the ordinary miracle of paying close attention. She thought Edwardine would have approved. Clara stood at her kitchen window on the last evening of that anniversary day, the March light going golden and then pink across the tree line in the distance, and she held a coin in her fingers, the one she had found on the rock on the way home from the very first trip to the vault, the one she kept separate from the 27 in the handkerchief because it was the last one she had found, and it was hers in a different way from the others, proof of something she could not entirely name. She turned it in her fingers and felt the bird on its face and the text along its edge and the familiar weight of it, specific and real and dense with whatever gold is dense with when it has been in the earth long enough to hold the cold. She had been the finder. She would always have been the finder. That was the thing about a trail that waited 90 years. The finder it was waiting for had always existed. The coins had been patient. The vault had been patient. Edwardine in her notebook had been patient. They had all simply been waiting for the right kind of stubborn, quiet, attentive person to walk into the trees and look down. The light faded. The tree line went dark. The coin was warm in her hand now. She set it on the windowsill beside the photograph of Edwardine Calder, the 2 of them side by side in the last of the evening light, the old woman who had built the trail and the coin she had left at the end of it, and she turned away from the window and went on with her life. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story. The night the ruling came down, Clara walked back to the forest alone. Not to the repository, not to the primary vault, just to the edge, the place where the grass ended and the roots began, and the light changed from open sky to filtered canopy. She stood there for a while with her hands in her coat pockets and looked into the trees and felt the weight of everything the year had contained settling slowly to its right level, the way water finds its level, without effort, simply by the nature of what it is. She had been in a courtroom earlier that day when Judge Wren read the ruling. She had sat very still and listened to each of the contested points addressed in turn, each one resolved the way Sylvia had said it would be resolved if the evidence held and the judge was fair, and the evidence had held and the judge had been fair, and the ruling had gone the way it went. 340 acres. The trust account. The bonds and certificates and the gold. The corridor damages. The full Calder estate. She had sat very still through all of it, and felt something she had been carrying for a long time quietly put itself down. After the hearing, Thomas Reyes had shaken her hand and said something kind. Sylvia had gathered her papers with the efficiency she brought to everything, and said we'll start the administrative filings tomorrow, and smiled at Clara in the way that meant she understood today was not a day for administrative filings, it was a day for something else. Mrs. Haas had walked beside her out of the courthouse and into the afternoon and had not said very much, because the two of them had been spending enough time together over the past months that speech was not always required. And then Clara had come here, to the edge of the forest, because this was where it had started, and she had wanted to come back to the beginning while the end was still new enough to feel real. The trees were the same as they had always been, bare still in the early spring, the buds just beginning to swell on the branches, the ground soft with the particular softness of late winter yielding to something warmer. She looked into the dark beneath the canopy and thought about the first coin, the way it had caught the afternoon light, and pulled her attention the way a word in a book catches the eye before you have read it, some quality of wrongness in the right place that the attentive mind cannot pass without pausing. She thought about Edwardine crouching in this same forest in this same light, placing coins in the ground with the patience of someone who has accepted that she will never see what she is planting come to fruit, only trust that it will. What that kind of trust required. What it cost. She reached into her coat pocket and felt the single coin, the one from the rock on the way home on that first day, the one she had kept separate. She turned it in her fingers and felt the bird on its face and the worn text along its edge and the particular density of something that had been made to last. She stood at the edge of the forest for a long time. The evening came down slowly around her, the sky going from pale blue to gray to the deep blue that precedes dark, and the first stars appeared one by one between the bare branches overhead. Behind her, somewhere in the direction of the town, a car moved along a road she could not see. The refrigerator in her new apartment was running. The library was closing for the night. The world went on with its ordinary business. She turned the coin over once more, and then she put it in her pocket and walked back toward the lights. She learned things in the months after the ruling that she had not expected to learn. She learned that having resources is not the same as knowing how to use them, that the gap between the two is wide enough for a person to get lost in if they are not careful. She learned that legal victory and practical change are related but not identical, that the ruling gave her the right to do something but did not tell her what that something should be or how to begin. She learned that the people who had known her before the ruling treated her differently afterward, not all of them badly, but differently, with a changed awareness of what she was now that altered the ease of the ordinary exchanges that had previously required nothing. She learned that Mrs. Haas was the same before and after, and that Sylvia was the same before and after, and that Thomas Reyes was the same before and after, which told her something about which kinds of people to trust and which kinds of relationships were built on something real enough to hold a change in circumstance without shifting. She learned that Renata, who had been placed in a different facility 8 months after the ruling, sent her a message every few weeks from wherever she was. Brief messages, nothing elaborate. Just the ordinary detail of a day, something she had seen or something she was working on. Clara wrote back with the same kind of detail. It was not a restored friendship because it had never been a friendship in the first place, but it was something which was more than it had been before,